Go ahead and get started. And so welcome, first of all, to everybody. Workplaces, as we know, can be very thriving places, and they can also be places that have a lot of friction and a lot of bullying. And as we get started, I'd love you to think for a moment of an example of each from your own history, from your own background, a place that you really loved working and maybe one that wasn't so enjoyable to work in. We'll be talking about these themes as well as Dr. Riane Eisler's distinctions of partnership versus dominator, systems and cultures, and also Dr. Jed Diamond's talk about work with men's health and well-being. And all of these topics are related, and we'll be talking about how. So the topic today is real power at work. It is a panel discussion with Dr. Riane Eisler and Dr. Jed Diamond. Well, we'll be really looking at how these principles are situated in the workplace. I'm Dr. Betty Woodman. Please feel free to call me Betty, and I'm delighted to be here. And there are really a couple guiding principles sort of leading all of this. One is your ideas are really have a huge impact. We are, you might say, at a crossroads right now. They could not be more important to so many areas of life. And many people know about your ideas. I think probably many of the people here do. But there are a lot of people who don't. And they ought to be mainstream ideas in a mainstream conversation. So the question is, how can we do that? How can we facilitate the information that's there and bring it out to that wider audience? And the second question is, how can we tap into all the resources, all the people, right? And have think tanks where people can come together and talk about best practices and ways to really, put their heads together and ways to put partnership principles into practice. So we'll certainly be talking about your work and partnership versus dominator and your work, Jed, with men's health and well-being. And we'll be talking about the significance to the workplace. But the question for the follow-on is, how can we bring people together, continue that discussion in a way that things are actually implemented, that we can withstand some of the forces that may detract or cause things to not sort of be implemented in the ways that we'd all like. So that's what's behind this. And we're doing two things. One, we have this panel right here, welcome, to provide more information. We want to do more to be providing ways for people to learn about the materials. But the second thing is this follow-on program mentioned briefly here, and then we'll come back to. And that is a way for businesses to understand more, right, about the benefits of partnership principles. Why businesses? As you know, these ideas fit in all walks of life. Business is a really great one. Lots of people work in workplaces, right? Most of us work in workplaces, number one. Number two, there's a really clear case, right? The evidence is overwhelming, and there has been a lot of research. Businesses that have partnership principles, that treat people well, that have positive environments, do better. There's less turnover, less people leaving, which is a huge business expense, right? People are more productive. Again, the data is clear there. So that conversation shouldn't be a difficult one. We should be really able to engage that conversation with business in a wonderful way. And then after that, the idea is, what is it that can cause things to not fully be implemented? And here we're looking at things like power relations, navigating power relations, understanding how we respond and how we could respond, and how we can become our most powerful selves. All of these ideas are part of this. And we are interested in the feedback and ideas from all of you. That's part of what this is all about. How do we take that forward? So I'd like to start first by engaging you some, because I'd love to hear more about your backgrounds. When at the beginning, I asked you to think about an example of a really great workplace that you had, that you enjoyed working at, you felt like you were very productive in. And you might just jump into the chat for a minute and write down a couple words that might describe why you thought it was so good. What was it that made it enjoyable for you? We can talk about all sorts of other examples, but often it's really those examples that we know ourselves that help us really focus on this. So just a couple, and we just may read a few out. If anybody wants to raise their hand and make a comment, that's great as well. But what is it about a workplace you've been in that made it feel so good to you, right? In a moment, and if it's easier, we'll also ask on the other side of that, what's an example of a workplace where there was a lot of tension, right? Or there was even bullying, or people you felt like were separated that felt unpleasant to you, right? Where you didn't feel as welcome to make your contributions or as productive. What was it about those workplaces? Do we have any over there? I mean, if Drew and Deb, if you could help me kind of, we've got
There's some
some in there.
great positive ones where people felt respected and listened to, senior managers being open to feedback and ideas. Yeah, I love the dynamic, engaging, intellectually challenging, meaningful work is popular in the chat here.
Yeah, yeah. There's one, meaningful work that was recognized. That's great. Yeah. Strong communication, common goals. That's a really nice one as well. Aspirational ethic of yeah, all for one and one for all. Absolutely. So many good ones, right? And then on the other side, I see some in there, lots of complaining and gossiping. And as on the other side, places that aren't as enjoyable, where people maybe get defensive or feel more fearful, right? Lynn says, at a young age, I was allowed to be innovative with time and motion study in an international company to improve services. Awesome, right? There are some really great examples out there, right? So, and I don't know if anyone wants to comment more on any of the examples that they thought of, but please feel free to jump in. We'd love to hear. Anyone? Okay, Byron, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I worked for a renewable energy company for a while, putting solar panels up, and we were aligned with values, and we played music and different things too. So that was really that was a highlight, I think, of my working. I'm retired now, sort of, but that was beautiful. And then I worked for a pro paint company too, and that was challenging. I mean, like propane, there's some issues with like flammability, I think, and things like that, so there was a little stress, but also what was happening was that there was a lot of shame, blame, guilt, domination, I think would be kind of a model that was challenging. It wasn't insurmountable, but it was challenging. Thanks.
Yeah, wow. No, thank you so much. And those are two great, sort of examples that show the contrast. And it's nice to think about that. What does make the difference between those companies as you think about your own examples? And if you were to design a company, you are starting from scratch, how would you design it so that you had the kinds of traits and qualities there that you wanted, right? Those are things to think about. What kinds of things might you put in place? Because this is what we're really talking about. Lynn, you've got your hand up as well.
Yes, at the age of 25, I managed to secure a job with, it's British American Tobacco here, and there's tobacco companies all over the world related to the head office here. And I went in to a situation where there were too many staff, and we're talking about catering, dining room, bar staff, kitchen staff, drivers, gardening staff. There were just too many people, which became obvious, it was because there were so many, they weren't fulfilled or feeling as if they were doing a proper job. So every time somebody left or retired, I didn't replace them. And of course it brought the budget down, which was a challenge as well, because the person I reported to wasn't happy that it looked as if he'd over budgeted. So it was a very challenging situation for me to cope with, because I was the only female manager as well. So, and very young, compared to a lot of them. They came in from overseas positions where they had been, and they were in there to train people from all over the world. Every month we had 30 new people from every different country. So but what I'm trying to say is it's very important to look at the welfare and the coping abilities of staff who could do a lot more. But if you've got too many, there's nothing worse. So that was all off my own bat, really, and not something I was employed to do, but it made a huge difference.
Well, thank you so much. It sounds like there were a number of things in there, including, trying to find ways to bring out what people's strengths were and their contributions, and also balance how many there were and if they were appropriately allocated. So lots of things to think about, right? And there can be systematic things to think about, particularly when we look at partnership. And we'll talk more about that in a second. So thank you, everybody, for comments. Really appreciate that. Just a quick example from my own background. That will do three things. I want to talk about power and what power really is, what real power is, patterns, right, and the common patterns, and then a little bit about gender. I heard that come up in yours, Lynn. So years ago, I was an engineer originally in my work life. I was working in engineering environments in a variety of capacities, later in sales and marketing for tech firms, and then later as a VP. And I noticed this dynamic everywhere I was. But at the time, I was working in a large organization where there was an awful lot of what you'd call bullying going on, right? It was friction, it was power over, it was jostling, it was in-group, out-group, and that kind of thing. At the same time, I was working at a domestic violence shelter as a volunteer, and later worked with children in foster group homes. And what I noticed suddenly was that the patterns were really similar between all three of these places, right? So the ways that people would be marginalized, right? The ways that they may be silenced, the ways they wouldn't bring forward new ideas. They were really similar. And of course, when I stepped back, that makes complete sense. And of course, I had not yet got my way to Dr. Eisler's work. But I was really noticing in real time that that was interesting. Of course, we're all part of a larger human family system, and these pop up in different areas. Another thing that I was very aware of was that this was not productive situation in this large. It was really thousands of engineers. It was a massive aerospace engineering organization. And what happened is that people did hold back. It was very fear-based. People would, sort of retreat, not bring up ideas if they thought other people may not like them, the kinds of things you don't want in a creative, innovative engineering kind of an environment. And that was happening. And of course, that makes complete sense as well. And I gradually came to see that this was not really power, right? This power over people, because it was contrary to all the goals that they had. It was ineffective. It was unproductive. It cost the organization creativity, innovation, productivity, money at the bottom line, right? That's not powerful. People may think that they're pushing people around, but it is absolutely not power. That is sort of a control drama. Power is when you are effective, when you're engaged in meaningful work, right? That matters, and you accomplish things, and you can join with other people in a collaborative sense, in a power with sense. So first, that came to me very early. I was also at the same time working on a board. Actually, I wound up working on a board of one of these agencies. And it happened to be one of the best experiences of my life. Could not be a more diverse group of people. So it certainly wasn't that we were all alike, but we were really united with a common mission. I think someone said that in the chat. I saw that come through. And we were committed. We were all focused on that goal. And we worked really well together. We had a number of challenges, and it was so enjoyable. So for me, this was going on at the same time, and I could really see it was early in my years as well. The last point about this story was gender. What I noticed in this engineering environment with this bullying is that it was mostly among men, right? Now, I was a woman there, and I was usually the only woman in these days. Don't know how much that's changed in engineering, but that's certainly the way it was then. And, I worked with a lot of really wonderful men, and I liked working with them. But there were some, right, who, by the way, may not have wanted me there. That was one thing. But they were also the people, same people, who did a lot of pecking order things with other men, right? Alpha, right? King of the hill, Top Gun kind of thing. And what does that mean? That means many other men suffer, right? Do we want this? Do we want people to be quiet and to be small, or do we want people bringing their ideas forward? And it really made an impression on me because I had great empathy and compassion. I saw just how difficult it would be to stand up in that. So it just wasn't understanding that we all have different ways that it can be hard and difficult and challenging to step up in these environments. And we can have great empathy for each other and sort of support each other with grace and understanding as we stand together, right? Because that's what we need to be doing across lines. Riane Eisler said it so nicely. And in fact, this article that was just out that we'll turn to in just a moment, that it's really the system that is sort of imprinting, is shaping us. It's not us as human beings, be male or female. It really is the system that is shaping some of this and causing difficulties for all of us. I think that when we look at those wonderful images that she portrays in her writings, and that Jed also points to as well, that certainly there's a better way for all of us, and that's what we're talking about. So let me just kind of take a look here. We are so that right there actually oops, someone is here. And that is Vinay. So and welcome, Vinay, if you are here. I don't know if he's here yet or not, but we have a second page, so I can't see there. But so those are some of the pressures. This is some of what we confront. And those are some definitions of power, what it really is to be powerful or not powerful. Then there's our reaction to that. So here's a question. Have you ever been in a spot where somebody has said something or done something and it's taken you a minute? You kind of step back and think, I can't believe they just said that, right? I can't believe they just did that. But you sort of don't know what to do in that moment, right? Some of us do know what to say right there in the moment. And then if you're like me, sometimes you go home that night and you think, oh, I could have said this, or I could have done that, right? Why didn't I say that? But right there in the moment, it kind of escapes you. This is another one of those places, especially in workplaces, where we can be ready because this stuff will come around again, right? So looking at the early signs, what does it look like when it starts subtly? Because it usually does, and then it only snowballs. And then what do we do? And by the way, my response may not be the same as your response because we're different people. Some people are more extroverted, might be able to charge right in the moment. Other people might need to think about it or strategize or look for allies, right? So there are different ways and strategies that you can respond. Courage, right, which is going to be part of standing for partnership and sort of being active in the world, is really taking the right action. Just as a quick background on that, for those of you who remember Greek philosophy, if you've read about Aristotle talking about the golden mean, courage is the midpoint, right, between holding back, not really doing anything, which doesn't make us feel good, right? If we don't do anything, we don't know what to say, that doesn't feel good. And foolhardiness, where maybe we just charge into the moment with something that isn't effective, right? It's that midpoint that we really need to think about. And that it means it's okay to reflect. We can take time to take a breath, and we can take time to formulate a strategy or to think of what we could do. But it's important that we do that because that's where we're going to really start feeling more and more empowered, be more powerful ourselves, and we're really going to be able to affect some change. So thinking about that, thinking about how we develop our own most powerful leadership style, thinking about what we can put in place for our organizations thoughtfully to help they have the guidelines to keep these, kinds of behaviors, this kind of environment in place is important. And that's what's behind the series that goes on from this panel that we're talking about, right? It's a way to bring people together to talk about what you're doing in your environment. Let's compare notes, right? We'll have a short briefing for a month. There's only 3 pieces of that on a topic. First one is power. You have a 1 hour to think about that with another person. That would be me at the moment, and really think about yourself and the ways that you best respond and how are you most powerful. And then go into a small group. We talk with peers who aren't from your organization and get ideas about what to do. The next month is looking for some of those traps and what you would do, and the same thing. And the last is, how do you develop that style for yourself, right? And you wind up walking away with a really good sense of who you are, how you respond powerfully, right? And help other people to do that as well, and what you can put in place for your organizations. So we do all of that. And then at the end, we have a discussion with everybody. So that is, Dr. Eisler and Dr. Diamond, we and I were talking about the importance of these concepts. They have done brilliant work and continue to do brilliant work. And we need to bring these out and activate them. The workplace is only one place. There are schools, there are other places as well, but it's also an important one. And it's got a really good case, right? Because it really does make a difference for business. So that's what we'll be doing. I'll talk a little bit more about that after, but we're right at the 1:30 mark. I will, and by the way, at the end, Deb or Drew will pop in the chat a link if you'd like to come and just talk. I'm calling it a power chat. It's not only efficient and productive and short, it's also really about power, about your use of power. And it's free if you just want to do that and think about your own organization, if that makes sense, or if you know people or in organizations that may be useful for. But we'll put that in after we've kind of gone through a panel. So without further ado, I am going to introduce our speakers. Any questions before I do that, or any comments? We will have the end as well to kind of circle back with some of this. Yeah, okay. Well, I am absolutely delighted to be here today. I cannot tell you how delighted I am. I am just a fan of these ideas. Riane Eisler, Dr. Riane Eisler, I have known of for longer than Dr. Jed Diamond, but I am thoroughly impressed with both of their bodies of work and think that the combination is exactly what we're needing right now. We really need to put these principles into place, right? So, Riane Eisler, in fact, she's got a wonderful bio, and I'm going to actually tell you some of it because she really deserves for all of us to hear about this and think about it. I will start with this amazing article. It was in Scientific American. How many of you, just a show of hands, how many of you saw it? Were you able to take a look at it? It was just out last Thursday, right? In Scientific American, and it's an amazing profile. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend going to read it. It's beautiful and inspiring and powerful. And we have Dr. Eisler here today. So we'll look at some of this as well, but that really tells you a lot about her. But in addition, she's the recipient of the Distinguished Peace Leadership Award. And our previous recipient was the Dalai Lama, so certainly an esteemed company there as well. She has written many books, I think over a dozen books, and her sort of best known book is The Chalice and the Blade. Again, any of you know The Chalice and the Blade? A beautiful book as well. That was the first one that I read, and when I found it, I was in the middle of graduate work on these topics. Actually, I think I was at Emory, and I think as I was in the Religion, Peace Building, and Conflict Task Force with you, Dee Smith was actually on my dissertation committee, and thank you for being here today. So it was a wonderful moment to be reading that as well. So many, many books, and we'll talk just more about that in just a moment. But let me also introduce Dr. Jed Diamond. Jed Diamond works with men's health and well-being. He also talks about this from a perspective that is aligned with Riane Eisler's partnership principles. He looks at the fact that men's health, and I'll let him explain more of this, that the health outcomes for men suffer, right, in relation to women, and that these are really important things to pay attention to. His latest book is as Long Live Men, and do I have that here? The whole title? I know I do, because the title is wonderful. There it is. The Moonshot Mission to Heal Men, Close the Lifespan Gap, and Offer Hope to Humanity. Incredible title. He is spearheading the Moonshot for Mankind initiative, another really important way to bring people into action around some of these ideas. So welcome to both of you. It is just such a delight and a pleasure for me to be here and for all of us to hear you. So thank you for being here. Let's see here. Are we all good on our microphones and everything? And Dr. Eisler, would you like me to call you Dr. Eisler, Riane? What would you prefer?
It doesn't really matter. You can call me Riane, as we do personally.
Okay, wonderful. And how about for you, Dr. Diamond?
Jed is fine.
Jed is fine. Okay, wonderful. Okay, and can everyone hear you? Let me just say, are you in California right now, Riane?
Yes, I am in California, and I am very happy to be with all of you. And I recognize some of you, like Belvy Rooks. Hi. And others, I think. So it's really a pleasure.
Okay, wonderful. So I know that a lot of people here are familiar with your work, but there may be some people who aren't as familiar with your work. And it's always good for a refresher and reminder in any case. So I'm wondering, you're most known for your distinctions between dominator and partnership systems. And I know I first read about that in The Chalice and the Blade. And would you just take a moment and explain how you came to use those terms versus patriarchy and matriarchy?
Well, the common assumption, of course, is that matriarchy is the opposite of patriarchy, right? And the alternative to patriarchy, but really it's just the other side of a domination coin. The real alternative is partnership. Now, how I came to this conclusion and how I saw these repetitive patterns cross-culturally, transhistorically, is actually rooted in my early childhood, because I was with my parents, a child refugee from the Nazis, from the Holocaust. And on Kristallnacht, I saw a gang of Gestapo men, Austrian, German, come to our house, break in, drag my father away. But it's called Kristallnacht because of all the glass that was shattered in Jewish homes, in synagogues, in businesses. But that night I also saw something else, and it's what I call spiritual courage. And I speak about it in that article that that Betty mentioned, because it made a tremendous impression on me. My mother had that courage, not the courage to, go out and kill the enemy or kill the dragon, that the way that we've been taught to think of courage, but courage to stand up against injustice out of love. And she recognized one of the Nazis as a young man who had been an errand boy for the family business, and she got furious. How and she turned to him and said, "How dare you do this to this man who has been so kind to you? I want him back." Now, my mother could have been killed. Many Jewish people were killed that night, but by a miracle, she wasn't. By a miracle, and yes, some money did pass hands, she was able to obtain my father's release and by a miracle we were able to escape. And so this left me with questions that I think really many of you have asked at some point of your life, probably. Does it have to be this way? When we humans have this enormous capacity for caring, for consciousness, for creativity, what I saw in my mother, why has there been so much cruelty, so much destructiveness, so much insensitivity? And, you know, the conventional stories, whether it's selfish genes or original sin, it's really the same story, isn't it? There's something wrong with, quote, human nature. Now, that is really a false story, as I found out many, you know, through my research, and as many, many scientists are now telling us. But the point of it was, how do we really understand what happened? How do we understand why we are at this place in our lives, in our history, in our world? And is there an alternative? And my research shows that there is indeed an alternative, but we can't see it. This is the point. We can't see it by looking through the lenses of conventional categories, which if you know, right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, capitalist, socialist, all of which, by the way, we inherited, of course, from more rigid domination times, didn't we? You know, when this top-down rule was still very much embedded in families, in businesses, in societies, in the world. And I drew from a much different database, and I won't go into all of this, but I began to see, looking at the whole of our history, at the whole of humanity, I began to see patterns that are not visible again through the conventional studies and through the conventional social categories. Because if you really think about it, for example, about right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, they marginalize or ignore nothing less than the majority of humanity, women and children. I mean, think about that for a moment. The majority of humanity. And if you leave out the majority of humanity, well, how can you see connections, right? How can you connect the dots? And this work really connects the dots. And I won't go into detail right now because I've been going on and on. But I'm suggesting to you to look at societies through these new lenses that take into account women, that take into account children, and therefore take into account families, take into account neuroscience, because neuroscience is very clear about the importance of these elements of family, of childhood, of gender, and of the early years when we are really internalizing either a domination orientation or a partnership orientation. And it's always a degree. It's a partnership domination social scale, okay? So I'm suggesting to you that once we use these categories, then we began to not only see that our past actually was, as so many books are now coming out, and as first reported in The Chalice and the Blade, that for millennia, human culture actually oriented more to the partnership side. You weren't taught that, were you? I mean, you were taught that's,
No.
you know, history begins in Sumer or something ridiculous. That's not true. And also these possibilities for our present and for our future. So I'm going to stop.
Okay. Well, yeah, thank you. It is so interesting about what we know. And that actually leads me to another thought, which is that you have been able to paint the picture of what can be, right? You've done that some in terms of what was in prehistory, according to all the archaeological data that exists. And also, I know you've worked on a scale from more partnership towards more dominator-like systems, right? So there's choices and there's variability, but it can be nice sometimes to take a moment and look at that picture of what partnership looks like, right? What did those societies look like that were more on that partnership side of the scale?
Well, if you compare domination or dominator-oriented societies with partnership societies, and partnership-oriented, of course, because, the perfect, as we're often told, is the enemy of the good, right? I mean, we're talking always of degrees. You see 4 elements that we are not taught to really look at. One is, in a domination system, what you have is what you've all described as being your worst relationships, really, your worst workplaces. You have these rigid power over, top down relations, but you also have them in families, as well as in workplaces, as well as in societies. So, whereas the more you move to the partnership side, you have much more equity, much more equality, much more democracy in the true sense of the word, not just elections, but really mutuality, mutual respect, mutual caring. And that's fundamental. But then you move further and you see, lo and behold, that actually childhood, and we're still in the first one, and family are very, very important, and that they're not considered really in conventional, very siloed approaches in our universities, in our mass media, right? I mean, family just isn't considered. But then as you move down, you also see that gender is not just a women's issue, but if you compare domination and partnership, you see that actually gender is not just a, quote, women's issue, or as Jed has extensively studied, just a men's issue. It is really a primary social and economic values organizing principle, which takes me to just a sidebar for a moment. If you look at our economic system, what you see is a gendered system of values in domination systems, where there's always money for prisons, right? I mean, who's that? That's the punitive male head of household, isn't it? Translated into the public sphere. But somehow there isn't enough money for caring for people, for children, for the sick, for the elderly, for anybody, really. Moving to the partnership side, there is really a very different set of values. And there are trends in that direction. I mean, when I first wrote my book on applying this to economics, the real wealth of nations, it's a play on Smith's The Wealth of Nations, just putting caring and economics in the same sentence, it was like, what are you talking about? And today, of course, people are talking, economists who live in some alternative reality, of productive versus reproductive. And reproductive is the so-called women's work, isn't it? I mean, it is all connected. Anyway, the third, part of this is, of course, built-in abuse and violence. You've all experienced it, haven't you? In domination-oriented situations, whether it's families, whether it's workplaces. but that's what holds the system together, the domination system. Fear. In my book, Sacred Pleasure, which is in itself a kind of a heresy, isn't it? And which prefigures a lot of my later work. It was the second book I wrote on sexuality and spirituality, and I really highly recommend it because it's a very personal book. But the point is that, yes, there is some violence, there is some abuse in partnership systems, but it's not institutionalized, it's not built into the system. And we're seeing that in the conversation about racism, aren't we? That it's really built into the system, this in-group versus out-group thinking and acting, starting with the in-group of mankind and the female other. And then it varies, it can be Shia versus Sunni or Sunni versus Shia in the Middle East, certainly racism, anti-Semitism, they're all, or homophobia. I mean, they're all the same thing. And the third part, of course, is story and language. The caveman cartoon, don't you? I mean, in one hand, he's got a club, a weapon, right? And in the other hand, he's dragging a woman by the hair. And that's the story that we tell children. That's the cartoon we show children before their brains are even fully, much less their critical faculties, are fully formed. We've got to change that because that is a false story. So these are the differences. We need to really change the narratives and have more humane and more accurate narratives about our past, our present, and the possibilities for our future. So that's sort of the first thing. And if you want to, you can go to the centerforpartnership.org website and go to Media Kit, and you can find some really good visuals on this, because I think that, a picture is worth a lot of words.
Wonderful. And there are so many follow-up questions there. One of which I'll table for a moment because I want to bring Jed into this discussion for a moment. But I would like to return in a few minutes back to your book, Sacred Pleasure, because I think there are some really interesting follow-ups there in terms of how we move forward. And I'd love to talk with you more about that. Jed, I know you write about men's health and well-being, and I actually have here 2 recent pieces that you wrote, and I'm going to read the titles as they were because the titles alone are wonderful. And then I have a question about something that you said in there. And one was, it was The Power of Partnership. It was a recent blog, I believe. Riane Eisler's Gifts to the World Are Needed Now More Than Ever, which is a theme we're talking about. Yours are as well, Dr. Diamond. But the other thing is the one thing men must do to ensure the survival of humanity, right? So both very provocative titles. But in both of them, you talk about the story about when you first met Riane and what you found a little bit different, perhaps, or what your experience was when you met her and learned of her work and that kind of thing. And I wonder if you might just say a few words about that.
Sure, Betty. Thank you. And thank you for being here. It is always a joy for me to be with Riane. I met Riane shortly after her book, The Chalice and the Blade, was published. I give you just a little bit of background of me to lead up to how I met Riane. I also grew up in a troubled family, not in the same degree that Riane describes with that kind of trauma, the Nazi atrocities. But I grew up in a family where my father had become increasingly stressed and depressed because he couldn't make a living to support his family. He had worked in a very hierarchical structure and was not able to find work. And he took an overdose of sleeping pills because he felt like if he couldn't support his family, he was not a man. And if you're not a man, you might as well not be here. Well, luckily he didn't die. He survived, but our lives were never the same after that. And I grew up wondering what happened to my father and whether it would happen to me and how I could keep it from happening to other families. And so when my first son, Jamal, was born on November 21st, 1969, I made a promise that I would be a different kind of father than my father was able to be for me, and that I would do everything I could to create a world where men were fully involved and healed with their families and their world and their relationships. So I wrote a book. My first book was called Inside Out, Becoming My Own Man, that talked about the male journey. And I must say that what my experience is, you can't talk about men or men's health without talking about women and women's health. We're intricately connected, as Riane so deftly and in such detail has made us understand. So when The Chalice and the Blade had come out, my first book came out in 1983, and I talked about men's health and my own journey. And what was so striking to me when I read Riane's book, and then I met her in San Francisco, I said, I've got to meet this woman, was that she was talking in a way that nobody else was at the time. There was so much fervor for feminist way of thinking and recognizing what was going on in women's world and what was happening with the domination. And often men were blamed. And it seemed like, men were doing some pretty horrible things. But what Riane, I think, poignantly said, and what touched me at the time, was that it wasn't men that were the problem, but was the dominator system. And this whole, in a sense, not always direct, but often indirect blaming of men, whether it's the patriarchy or the men's world or men in general, was something that she said from her own life, from her own experience. It wasn't men, it's the system. So that was one thing that touched me. The other was that the trauma that we experience in families is often where we experience the beginnings of this trauma. And what I then went into in my work was family systems and how to prevent the trauma in family systems so that this doesn't show up in all our rest of our lives, because often the trauma that we experience in our families, that often we know now from studies with adverse childhood experiences, the traumas are often very subtle. They're not necessarily although some traumas are, violent, beating up, horrible, but they can also be abuse, neglect, and abandonment, often because of not understanding the underlying causes. So the other kind of piece that Riane, I think, brought out is that in order to change the systems, we have to understand men's world and women's world. We live in complementary worlds, but there are differences. And what happens to women often is a different thing and a different way than what happens to men. And we know that the suicide rate, for instance, is 4 to 18 times higher for males than it is for females of a similar age. Think about that, 4 to 18 times higher. On average, males die by suicide at rates much higher. Well, why is that? And we'll talk more about the way in which the traumatic experiences of men and women in many ways are different, but what they have in common is the dominator system, to the degree that's there in the families and the workplace, in society, will determine the kinds of problems that we have. We may manifest them differently, but we know that the antidote to that is not blaming men or blaming women or having men and women, in wars against each other or trying to fight each other, but men and women coming together in partnership. So that was my original meeting of Riane. We have been friends and colleagues for now these many years. And anytime we get a chance to hang out together or to feed together, which we've had good fortune to do that over the years, it's a blessing. And I just really, and I think you can get the debt I have to Riane with her work and how it's totally, foundationally changed my life and the work that I do with men and their families.
Yes, thank you so
Thank
much, Jed. I really appreciate that. And I just want to quickly say that really there are two basic forms of humanity, the male form and the female form, and how these roles and relations are organized, again, affects both halves. It affects the whole system. It affects the values. And this is something that we are systematically taught to ignore by marginalize it as just a women's issue or just a men's issue, which is absolutely nonsense. It's a basic social and economic organizing principle. So that's why I saw that. But anyway, please go ahead, Betty.
Let me just make a quick comment to what Riane just said. There's a comedian, Elaine Boozler, who made a comment about the different worlds of males and females that was, humorous, tongue in cheek, but I think spoke to this truth. She said, when women get depressed, they eat or go shopping. Men invade another country. It's a whole different way of thinking. And I think that kind of sums up some of the ways in which women are traumatized in one way, men are traumatized in a different way. And the reason that I focus on men isn't just because I want to improve the lives of men, but because I recognize that if men are traumatized, we do some pretty destructive things that in some ways are uniquely part of what males do when they're traumatized, like invade other countries, are violent externally and violent internally, which is where the high suicide rate comes from. All of these things are related.
And can I just add something to this? Well, two things. One, I don't know if you know this, Jed, but the suicide rate among girls is now much higher than among boys. And it is very much due to social media and to these rigid gender stereotypes. And to the shaming and the blaming. There was a question about that. Of course, that's built into the system. But the other thing I wanted to say is that we really have to focus much, much more on this gender-based socialization, these rigid gender stereotypes, which are needed to maintain domination systems, starting with ranking the difference between female and male, to equating it with inferiority, and superiority, with dominating or being dominated, with being served and serving. And this is a model for all in-group versus out-group actions and thinking. And they go together, don't they?
Oh, and so many rich threads here. I'm going to take one at a time, and I hope we can get to many of them. But yes, the importance of the system, I think clearly from the comments that you're both making, this system is not benefiting anyone. It's harmful to men, it's harmful to women, and it continues on. One of the things that I wanted to turn back to with Jed for just a moment is, your descriptions of the man box, right? And how that evolves with these ideas of the system of domination that's shaping us, right? That's allowing certain ways of being for both men and women. And if you had any comments, first about that, but also there are a lot of discussions popping up these days about masculinity, and they're popping up into a variety of different categories. Some I think are very helpful, and some seem to be going back to less of the systems view of the gender socialization, the gender system, and more into this sort of, what differences are and holding them up as inevitable. And I'm wondering if you have any comment about that as well.
Yeah, a couple of things. There are these gender differences. We call it the man box in men's world. It's the conditioning that operates at all levels in society, that both describes how men are supposed to be and how women are supposed to be, and often they're destructive to both. One that I grew up with, I don't know if you all remember this little nursery rhyme, that what little girls are made of. They were made of sugar and spice and everything nice, as opposed to little boys who were made of variously described snips and snails and puppy dogs' tails. And when you think about, again, the violence, well, what happened to the puppy dog and the tails being, there's an element of one, difference, negativity, and often violence in the way men are built and how we are. And the destructiveness permeates the way we see the world and the way we operate in the world. And the solution has been in the past to look for somebody to blame, or to look for who's the scapegoat. And as Riane has said, there's the dominator culture always looks for who's the other, who's the one that we need to get. And we continue to do that. And what I would just suggest with Riane, I think would agree that we're really at a critical point in human history, where these destructive aspects of our being, dominator culture, if you will, or systems, are creating now a pattern where humanity itself is in danger. That it isn't just one part of the system or an individual part, but all of humanity, what we're doing to the environment, what we're doing to our world. And I think it's why the calling that I think all of you who are on this, and all of us that feel an urgency to come together, because this is the dark night of the soul, and also the opportunity for a new dawning that I think we're feeling, and an urgency to come together in some new and creative ways that really look at the deep system change that needs to happen. And Riane, I think, has been absolutely the leader in this, in being able to both articulate it, to call on all of us who can then put it into practice in our own parts of our work and our world. And Betty, I think you're, one of, in a sense, the younger part of the next generation that is stepping up to do these, as are many of you who are on the call at all different levels of our age and stage of life. So I'm very excited about what we have to look forward to all together.
Wonderful. Let me ask a couple questions about the workplace, because all of these ideas that you're talking about are relevant across the board, as we know, and the system is very connected, and many of us are situated in workplaces, and there are maybe things we can do tangibly there that not only help us help the awareness of partnership, but also, help our workplaces be the kind of places we'd like to be working and to succeed in more ways. And that brings me first back. It's a question for both of you, really, but on how you see your ideas and your work applying in the workplace. But specifically, Riane, I'm looking at this article that you were just in. Towards the end, you really did elaborate on the in groups and the out groups. It was really a wonderful moment, as you just did again. And in the way that we have under sort of a dominator system, superior and inferior dichotomies, right? And they're usually based on difference and based on groups, and we have many of them. But that's because the underlying model looks for a person and the other, right? Versus a collaborative partnership kind of model. And in the workplace, that certainly brings us to DEI, right? All the discussions we have about the many ways we're different. And in addition, two other things I'd like to point out. One is, the ways that men perhaps may not always feel heard. I wonder if there can be resistance because bullying that's happened within male groups is a real thing as well, just as exclusion based on difference is a real thing. And when I look across everybody in the workplace, it seems as if there's just such a natural common ground for all of us to stand together. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about bringing people together so that it isn't, a certain, very, interested party that follows DEI. I think everyone here is certainly understanding of the benefits of diversity within the workplace, within the various opinions and perspectives we have on reality, but also for those who may hold back, right? That there are ways that everyone can be excluded, and that partnership is meaning that everyone is included. I think sometimes there may be a fear that if I'm not on top, it's just a dominator, somebody else is on top, and then therefore I'm threatened. So that's one part of a question I have, thinking strategically about that. The other is even recognizing difference in roles. I go in and work with companies very often which have some toxic dynamics happening. And it's amazing. You have engineers and manufacturing people, sometimes different kinds of people, right? And sometimes those people don't get along. You have lawyers and paralegals, you have the front office and the back, and these ways that we draw distinctions. And part of what we want to be able to do is bring people to the common mission so that they can see, right, that there is a common ground for everybody to be standing together on. These are prevalent issues in business all over the place. And it's an area that I think both of your ideas have an awful lot of relevance. And I wonder if you have any comment on any of that.
Well, one thing I would say is that just as we need new categories, new language, the partnership domination systems rather than the conventional ones, we need new language in so many ways. Now, some of the trends have been actually new language, like transparency. I mean, that is a concept that is a partnership trend, isn't it? It's how can you talk about transparency in a domination system? It is a non sequitur, right? I mean, of course, and freedom in those systems is really equated with the freedom of those on top, whether it's in a family or whether it's in a business or whether it's in a state, to do what they darn please, isn't it? To do what they want. That's not real freedom. And it's only freedom. But I think that two new words I've introduced are very, very important here in the business area. And it's the difference between hierarchies of domination and what I call hierarchies of actualization. And I've introduced this new language because we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. I mean, there have to be some loci of responsibility, right? We need parents, we need teachers, we need managers, we need leaders, but how power is defined and used, first of all, is very different in a hierarchy of domination. We know that it's fear-based, You better do as I tell you to do, or else you're going to have a lot of pain. You know, even death in a dictatorship, really, which of course is a rigid hierarchy of domination in a state. In a hierarchy of actualization also, is contrasted with a hierarchy of domination, it's very interesting because benefit, respect, responsibility don't just flow from the bottom up, they flow both ways. So that those on top are also really responsible to those in the hierarchy that have positions where they have to execute some of the things that those on top decide. And hierarchies of actualization are also much more flexible. In other words, you may be a leader in some situations, right? But I will be a leader in other situations. So it's a whole new way of thinking for which we need new words and new thinking, because really we know that language is so very important in how we behave, isn't it? If we don't have a word for it, I mean, a lot of people who have read my work say, now I have words for, you know, a real alternative. And the same with the hierarchy. So that those are some of the thoughts that come to mind.
I'm just nodding my
Okay.
head with what Riane is saying, because it's, I agree with what she's saying. And some of the language that I think translates into the workplace from kind of my core experience, which is in family systems and in how we grow up and the language we have in relationship. And in workplace, in many ways, we're bringing in some of the same dynamics of our families. You know, there are mothers and fathers, parents, there are, you know, sibling interests and rivalries and so on. If we don't recognize our own family dynamics, and that's the benefit of kind of the work that I bring people into, of recognizing the connections between the families we grew up in, some of the pain and suffering or trauma, and how then we get triggered in our workplace environments, and what we need to heal by not only bringing in the partnership into the workplace, that can also improve the relationships in our own families and relating in our love lives. So that's one area that I think we can improve and share. And the other is this concept and language that I'm bringing into the dialogue, which I call the moonshot for mankind and humanity. And Betty mentioned it at the beginning, which is a way for our recognizing, in a sense, the way in which male-dominated systems have been destructive at all levels in our personal lives, our relationship lives, our work lives, and the larger systems of our communities. And in some ways, we need to heal that dynamic, not only for men, but for our relationships with everybody. So moonshotformankind.com is a new focus and a new website that we have. I invite you to join that. And for those that want to reach me, somebody had put questions in the chat. I'm at Jed, J-E-D, at MenAlive.com. So if things didn't get answered here today, feel free to drop me an email and I'd be glad to respond to anything that we didn't get a chance to cover.
Thank you so much. We've got a question from Belvy, and in just a minute, Jed, we'll also see whether we can get to some more of those questions in the chat. If other of you would like to put your hands up, please feel free. But Belvy, you've had your hand up. I think you're
Can't
Yeah.
hear you. Your mic.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes. One of the things that I've just been sitting with and thinking about and listening to this really important exchange and dialogue is that sometimes how difficult it is for us to connect critical dots. For instance, I was, Riane, listening to you, certainly there was a period in Germany where the Nazis said that the Holocaust did not exist.
You know, Billy,
It
I'm
hadn't
having
happened. It didn't
trouble
exist.
hearing you. Can you talk a little louder or put your?
I'm actually in Mendocino, so I'm next to a redwood forest, and sometimes the trees kind of don't love Wi-Fi. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you better.
You can hear me better. I was just saying that sometimes it's not. We have difficulty, as you've both pointed out, in connecting critical dots. And one of the things that I'm sitting with now and in this conversation as well is that there was a period when the Nazis said that the Holocaust did not exist. It had not happened, could not be taught. And the world rose up and said that that's called Holocaust denial, and we could not have it, because if we didn't understand what had happened, we were likely to replicate it. One of the things that I've been sitting with, and others that I know, is across the South, and we're being told, and teachers are being fired because they're trying to teach about slavery. And that slavery wasn't that bad, it really actually helped you develop skills. Now, one of the things that's been really interesting for me is that the people who understood and understand Holocaust denial seem not to understand the necessity of responding to the erasure of an important part of American history. And the rationale then was we had a name for it. And what's happening in the US at this point, relative to slavery and the elimination and the rewriting of American history, we seem not to be able to connect the critical dots across these divides.
And of course, I will respond to that, Belvi, because we're talking about denial, aren't we? Which is really built into domination systems, starting with in early childhood, where children are taught to deny the pain inflicted on them in dominator families that are characteristically very punitive. You know, wait till your father gets home, right? Is the thing. And to deflect that rage, that anger, that fear to the out group, you know, whether it's a different race, whether it's anti-Semitism. So I was not aware of that. I think that there are certainly parallels in this. And of course, what it really demonstrates is the need to think not in terms of German or American, you know, but in terms of partnership and domination. And what's happening, I don't have to tell you, is this denial, which is characteristic of domination systems. So I'm glad you brought that up. But the denial also affects the workplace, you know, which is what we're talking about here. And so does this male socialization, which forces men to deny. See, men do get some emotions, actually. They get anger and contempt, which are very, you know, very appropriate for those on top. But what they don't get are the soft, the so-called feminine emotions. And I think that this is really ridiculous, frankly. It deprives men, as you know, the stereotypical socialization deprives both women and men of their full humanity. But getting back to denial, this is something, denial and trauma, domination systems are really trauma factories and denial factories.
And I'd add one more part to that is there is also, I think, beyond denial, a disinformation where there is within a dominator system the desire to put out information that not only denies but gives a lie to reality that we see happening in many sectors, such that truth is clouded. Reality is, anybody can have a different reality. And the result is that kind of disinformation poisons, the whole system. And that's, as Riane says, is a characteristic of the dominator system that's even more, I think, insidious than denial. Denial, we can start to see it, but the disinformation, we don't even know what reality is anymore. And that can then control people, and that's where you lead to the kind of fascist system that Riane experienced, and that is unfortunately still a present danger in our world.
Well, and I would say that denial and disinformation are interconnected.
Right.
Because denial is based on disinformation, whether it's climate change denial or whether it's election result denial or whether it is COVID-19 denial. But I think that it's also very much related to the socialization of these rigid gender stereotypes that really divide and conquer. And that is also built in to the domination system. I mean, it's a system that affects everybody very, very negatively. And I think that the contribution of going to some of the basics, like gender socialization, like what happens in families, like economic, what is or is not considered productive work in economics, which goes back to both Smith and Marx, who felt that the work of caring for people was to be performed for free by a woman in a male-controlled family, which was the norm in their time. But it informs GDP today, doesn't it? Where a log is only part of, where a tree, is only part of GDP when it's a log, when it's dead, right? Because it can then be traded. But the trees on which we depend on for breathing, for oxygen, are not even part of it. I mean, we need new metrics. Anyway, we're talking about many trends in a partnership direction and many counter trends in a dominator, more rigid dominator direction. That is the real struggle for our future. And it's not between right, left. You can have dominator regimes on both sides, or capitalist and socialist, again, the same thing. It's between these two configurations.
Oh, what a conversation. And I'd love to weigh in just a little bit with Belvy with a thought. And also I'm seeing that Thea posted something here, Dr. Smith, and I may read this if you don't mind, and then sort of return to what Belvy was asking, because there's a couple thoughts about directions. Sometimes I think it can be so frustrating to see what happens and to not see a way forward. So first, and Thea, you're welcome to read this. I'm just going to grab it out of the chat. And if you'd like to comment, please feel free. He said, "Thou shalt not be aware" is consistent with the rejection of critical theories, including the reactionary attacks on wokeness and critical race theory that we're seeing right now, for sure. So, Thea, if you wanted to jump in there, that's fine. But also, Belvy, as you're talking, I was also thinking about what we're doing here today and what's possible to continue in terms of conversations, right? So what we're doing right here is look, and to follow on, we're having a conversation, a wonderful conversation here with lots of threads. But we have a executive coaching series coming up. It's fitting into a model that happens in business, executive coaching, but it's on a topic. And in this case, it's the topic of power relations within the business workplace. And oops, something just happened here. Okay. And my screen just kind of went. And so we look at power, but then we also really understand, you know, how these things can start coming in. This middle module does an intersectional job of looking at the different factors that can push us out of integrity with ourselves, meaning pushing us toward a position of power over or power from, meaning conformity, right? And you could see or envision a series like this being a coaching series on a variety of different topics, right? Bringing people from different walks of life who are very interested in certain topics. This one is the workplace. But when you were talking, I was feeling a certain what do we do next and how do we bring people together and how do you sort of strategize a response, maybe even, because I'm sure there are many people that really are concerned, even if that term hasn't emerged yet. And the next question for us on so many fronts is, what are our next steps? And how do we take these ideas that we know are so true and so valuable, and how do we put them into action? So, you know, that's a conversation I'd love to continue if you would as well, perhaps after this. So thank you so much for your comment.
Can I just add one thing, which is that one of the ways that we can is just this, by learning really to use our voices, our networks, to show that actually a partnership in the workplace, in companies, caring in companies is more effective, And this is in human terms, and yes, ultimately in the long term, in economic terms. And to do that, of course, we also have to use our voices because we're in this very strange place right now of having to adjust, quote unquote, you know, like Freud said, therapy has moved now from adjusting to humanistic or positive psychology, you know, flourishing, right? And that is what this is really about. And this is why I really am so excited about this program that Betty is offering, because it's getting down in the weeds. It's really helping us be more effective in changing the system, frankly.
Are there more questions? We'd love to welcome some. Jed, I don't know if your hand is up or you're just...
I do want to answer, if I may, that of course, Susan, collective shame, blame, and guilt are part of how domination systems maintain themselves. I mean, there's no question. And it is what leads really to the denial and to the misinformation at the same time. And it is so strange, Belvy, that it is people who consider themselves Christian, you know, are so punitive, as in God-fearing, you know. But that tells it all, because their whole idea is based on fear, on scarcity, and domination systems create artificial scarcity. And that goes way back to when the domination system started. And, you know, whether it's a Chinese emperor or an Arab sheikh or an Indian pasha or a feudal lord or trickle-down economics, it's that those on bottom are to content themselves with the scraps falling from the opulent tables of those on top. I mean, that's what it's all about. And it's domination economics. It isn't just neoliberalism or trickle-down economics. Anyway, I'm going to go, but I just want to say I'm so glad to meet all of you, and I look forward to more. And I'm going to disappear.
Well, thank you so much. We'll continue the conversation. I know we have a couple questions. Abraham, you had your hand up. I'd love to hear your question, if you're still here. Others, I think Jed may be here for a few minutes longer. Yes.
And I also want to thank Jed, because his contribution is so important, and all of you. But I'm going to go.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Riane. Appreciate your time. Yes.
Okay. Yep. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Such a pleasure and a rare opportunity.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And before Abraham, I saw you had your hand up. I know you have something coming up. So if you had a question still, I don't know, did he leave? Can you see in the chat?
I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Yeah. Because I thought you might have something that was relevant to this. So thank you for putting your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question. I'm sorry, Riane had to leave, but I'm curious. Something I've struggled with in also trying to connect with people around this question around what we're domination and partnership. The language that I find has been helping me is coercion and support, but I think it's getting at the same concepts. And there are some people, many people, who get really caught up on one or both of those words. And it's almost like they can't hear the concepts behind them because they have a certain association with that word. And I'm wondering, with domination and partnership, I'm imagining that there's also people that those words feel connected to, and people hear them and say, yes, that's it. And there's probably some people who say that's not how I see it. So I guess my question is there a strategic value in actually making space for people to come up with their own language for it? Like, that's what I had to do. I had to let go of trying to get a certain language frame for people to use it. I said, okay, I don't care what you call it. You want to call it support, you want to call it partnership, you want to call it mutuality. I don't care. Can we learn to talk about it and even celebrate that we talk about it in different ways, but with the understanding that we're all talking about different ways of describing the same thing. And the same thing with coercion or domination. Is there a role for making space for intentionally to let people come up with their own language so they don't get caught up on the language of other people?
I'll make a quick comment on that, Abraham, and to everybody. I think there's a need for both, and it depends, I think, a lot on the context that we create and the container of partnership or the container of safety. And I think there's room for people putting whatever language they want to the concept of, the equality, the coming together. And I think there's a value and I've been, following Riane's language for a long time. And I find her language very inviting for a whole lot of people, and a recognition that this really isn't about us being the good guys and them being the bad guys, because in, I think, significant ways, we're all a mixture. We're all on the continuum somewhere. We've all been infected by 6,000 years of domination, and we all also have even longer history when you look at our prehistory of partnership. And so I think finding language that we can all relate to, and also being open to letting each of us create a language that fits for us, I think both are needed.
Yeah, for sure. I think I would agree with that as well. I think part of what's really important is demonstrating the value of a partnership principles, or support, as you're calling them, Abraham, and having people really see how it is that those are beneficial. To your point, Jed, we do, right? We have assumptions in us, right? Even when we don't want them to be there. And I think this is how sometimes things can sneak up on us. Subtle patterns can happen that we may not flag immediately because it's the water we're swimming in. We've become so accustomed to it. And that's part of what's really important. And that's we talk about this, right? In this programming that we do, to be alert, to recognize what they are in the workplace. They'll be similar in other places in your life categories as well. But what are those things? And then how do we respond even in those early stages, right? To maintain our integrity, right? So that we're staying over in that partnership model. It's hard. We react, we respond, we get defensive, we get fearful, right? We're human beings. But the more we understand it and then we can start practicing it, the more we can really move towards it. So using this language and having something that a lot of people recognize, like partnership and dominator, and then also having room for people to call this what works for them, like coercion or support, I think can work. I think what's important is that we really understand what keeps us from the support side of that or the partnership side of that, and learn more and practice more. So we can demonstrate what that looks like. Thank you so much. Are there other questions? I know there have been some in the chat. I don't know, Deb or Drew, if you see any good ones in there, we might sort of bring out. If anyone else would like to put your hand up, please. Jed, if you have a few minutes more to be here. Adriana.
Hi, I actually put it on the chat. Thank you so much. This has been really helpful and really valuable for me. And the question to Jed is how, or to anybody, and yourself, Betty, is how do you view the approach of using, because this is what I come from, this is what I focus on, using our most valuable resources, which is our time, our energy, our talent, by using the partnership system rather to enhance the value that we all can contribute to our workplaces, to our societies, to our homes as a way to improve our life experiences. I think that those things can be kind of connected in a way that makes sense for people, like you were saying, Betty, about showing people how to see the value and the benefit on implementing a partnership kind of approach in the environment rather than dominant. And I think that for me is very connected to the use of what we value the most, the use of our time, our, our talent, our energy, as long as other things. But to me, that's kind of the focus of my attention in a way.
Well, do you mind if I jump in really quickly, Jed, first?
Sure.
Yeah. So I think that is such a beautiful question, because it brings us to the power dynamics and helps us recognize that the very first power relationship we ought to think about is the one with ourself, right? Are we being true to ourself? Are we being in integrity with ourselves? Have we spent time to really think about what matters most to us and how we are spending our hours and our time and our efforts, to use the description you had, Adriana, because that matters. And it's when we're really fully in integrity with ourselves that we're going to be able to have access to that power too, right? To that real power, to the ability to then join with others in a very mutual way for the partnership, for the power with that we really want. So when we do that, we are going to be feeling better. When we are in integrity with ourselves, we don't feel conflicted, right? Things may still be challenging, they may be difficult, but it's nothing like, sort of betraying yourself on some level. So really being clear on that to the best that we can. And then that, I think that was part of your point, if I understood you. Part of that is it models for other people, right? What it is to be fully yourself. I'm different than you, who's different from somebody sitting next to you, right? And that's how we bring our value to the world, is through our perspectives and through ourselves. So Jed, if you had anything more.
Yeah, a comment I'd make about the question is, I live in a place, all of you live in a place. We're right now in a virtual reality place where we're able to connect, but I think it's important that we be in place. And for me, I live in a little town called Willits, California. And one of my practices, which I've already done today, is I go out and I walk in the community and I walk in the neighborhood. And I do that every day. And it's a practice of connection to not only myself, so I don't wear headphones, I don't listen to music, I just am with me. And I believe that we don't exist in the world as individuals. We all are connected. And we remind ourselves, I remind myself every day when I walk and I connect with the birds and the trees and the sounds of nature, as well as people that I run into, as well as the dogs in the neighborhood and the cats. And I happen to be where there are deer and wildlife. So I would encourage everybody to have a practice that reconnects us to not only our environmental world, you know, our physical world of nature that we've gotten disconnected from, but the world of reality in the sense of real people, real animals, real trees, real birds that are available to us that we often in our very connected world and in the connected world we're in now, we spend a lot of time, as I am, you know, as you all are, 2 hours now. I'm going to go out for a walk, I guarantee, after this before I go to lunch. So I just invite you all to find the ways in which you connect in all of those ways to yourself, with the natural world, with other people in your local communities and neighborhoods where you live.
I love that. And I think that there's a nice tie in Jude. I see you. One moment. That there's a nice tie there for the business world as well, right? Those connections we have with people in the business world, and that power, right? That sort of being in integrity with ourselves. That's where we can really be our most effective selves too, on that level of things, right? And it just makes me think of the Howard Thurman quote that we've all heard, right? Don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive, and go do it, because what the world needs is more people who have come alive. I love that quote. I'm sure many of us do, but that's part of that same theme, right? Of being true to yourself, paying attention, doing the things that restore you, that rejuvenate you. That's where you'll find your greatest sorts of power as an individual, and also, again, within the workplace. Jude, you've had your hand up. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yes. Welcome.
Okay, so I totally agree with that last, with what Jed was saying and you were saying, and having a true partnership with the rest of nature, the rest of the beings here and in our workplace, consulting with them when they are part of whatever we're doing. If we're making a land use plan, or it's really important to consult with the other species, because we are partnerships, co-creating the world with them. But my other point, and this is maybe a downer for people, is we start with the domination of religion. And if our culture is based, and it doesn't matter where you look in the world, whether you have a lot of gods or whether you have one God, it's fear and it's hierarchy. If you have a guru, all of those systems are hierarchical. So how do we have a partnership with God? However you want to imagine God.
And what are your thoughts about that? What first kind of what do you think about that?
Okay, well, I'm not a religious person in terms of I have a partnership with the rest of nature. That is where my and with my my own energy and spirit. And all my life I have rebelled against the hierarchy, wherever it is. So yes, that's where I am. I'm an agnostic, I guess,
Mhm.
if you want to put a label on
And
it.
yep. So, and just to make sure, is one moment, I was just kind of taking a look. I got distracted for a minute. Is Jed still here, or did he need to go?
No,
Are you still here, Jed?
yes, I'm
I'm not.
here. I just
Oh,
put my
okay. I
hand
wasn't.
down, but I'm
Oh,
still here.
okay. Well, I got distracted, and I'm sorry, Jude. I may not have heard your question clearly enough because I thought, oh my goodness, did Jed leave? And I want to make sure to thank him if he was leaving. So to make sure, Jude, that I understood you, you're kind of asking a question about religion and a relationship with God. And what are you curious about particularly?
Well, I'm wondering with because all the God systems are very hierarchical, and caste systems and guru
Mm,
systems, and yeah, all the religions, and a lot of fear involved in that, and a lot of division. So if you are a religious person, which I'm not, how do you have a partnership with God and not a
mm.
hierarchical relationship?
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I understand you now. So first, I'd love to ask, have you read Riane Eisler's first book, The Chalice and the Blade, by chance?
I, I think I read it a long time ago, so I don't really
Yeah.
remember.
You know, you might find it interesting to go take another look at that. And the reason I went to that and thought about that is that there are a lot of different ways that people think of the God in people's personal religious spheres. But there are people who very much see God, sort of infused through nature. And from the way you described your question, I made me think if perhaps that was sort of aligned with you. And in that way, we're all sort of embedded and interconnected and interdependent on each other. So it's kind of a larger whole. And some of the goddess cultures that come up in prehistory, right? Were very much that way. They looked at nature, they looked at the harvest, they looked at bounty. And as Riane says very nicely in The Chalice and the Blade, they were not the flip opposite of patriarchies. There were men and women who were priests and priestesses and working together in many aspects of life. And so it was not a hierarchical kind of system. So again, people have different ways of understanding whatever it is we mean by a higher power, by God. Some people have goddesses. And if that's, you might take a look at some books like that. You might find them interesting.
Yeah, let me make a comment too. I think you
Yes.
you
Yeah.
you talk about The Chalice and the Blade, which is Riane's most probably well-known book, but what I'm holding up
Yeah.
is her latest book.
Yeah.
It's called Nurturing Our Humanity: How Domination and Partnership Shape Our Brains, Lives, and Future, with co-written with an anthropologist, Douglas P. Fry. And she talks in depth in that book about indigenous cultures, even pre, the ones you're describing, that for 2 million years, hunter hunter cultures. And I think what Jude is recognizing is that all modern, quote, religions, the structured religions, occurred during this last 6,000 years, which seems like a long time, but the dominator cultures had been in force during those times. So sometimes we need to go back to our roots, which is, quote, prehistory. And Riane and Douglas really speak to that in the new book. So I just want to highlight that. It was mentioned, but not necessarily one that been spoken to a lot today.
Yep. Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you for your question. I'd love to just pull the threads back here again here at the end This has been really a delightful conversation, and I really appreciate Jed. I'll thank you more in just a moment, but I also want to welcome anyone who's interested in continuing this conversation, right? Or has ideas about how this conversation could continue to maybe set time. I think Deb had put in the chat, calendly.com/Betty J. Woodman. It's just to come by and talk for a few minutes about ways that we could set up structures. And it could be for you on an ongoing basis if you're interested in talking about putting these into action, or if you know of groups of people that you think you have ideas about that, about how we can do that. One of the things that I think is really important right now, it feels to me like we're at a juncture point, is that we take this wonderful work that has been done from both Jed and Riane, and it is established, it's still ongoing, and we are able to mobilize that, right? And to look at it. Right here, we're talking about the workplace. I think there's a huge opportunity because it's so beneficial to the workplace as well. But of course, the workplace employs most people in one form or another. And that this is a way for people to understand and to feel, right, the real value of being in that kind of environment versus a toxic or power over kind of environment. And feeling that and experiencing that helps strengthen, right, our understanding and commitment to that. That's what we're really trying to do. And I know as the decades go on, more of them than perhaps you may know, Jed, I become even more committed, right, to how can we do this and how can we really work together. There are lots of people that are committed to this. So please, if you have time and you'd like to stop by, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your thoughts, or email me, bettyjwoodman@gmail.com. And I'd like to take a moment and thank Jed. I'll thank you officially in case people have to go, but then maybe we could stay if there is another question or two. Thank you so much, Jed, for being here and for your conversation. I think you and Riane were a perfect complement today in this discussion. I'm so glad you both were able to be here, and I'm so glad that you were able to interact in the ways that you did. So thank you for your time. If we were all off camera, we could all be clapping. So yay. Thank you so much. Yay. That's right. There we go. Yay.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Yeah, thank you. If any last questions, I'm happy to stay for a few more minutes, but if not, we're just about at the hour. So yeah, okay, bye-bye. Well, thank you so much, everybody.